Well, first and foremost, what can I say? I thank you so much for coming out tonight, and for Miss Karen Page Davies for allowing us to use their wonderful venue to host this event. And I tell you what, in some sense, I feel like she and I are kindred spirits because we both love to talk. And anybody who knows me, and there are many of you in this room that do, you know that once I get started as well, then it's very, very hard to get me to stop. So, yes, I understand completely, but I certainly sincerely thank Karen and her husband for helping make this event possible tonight, and for all of you who have supported this event and who have made it out this evening. Thank you so very much. Also, my wonderful wife, Vanessa, who's sitting right here in the front row. If it wasn't for her, I don't know how she puts up with me and with my probably more than a mild obsession with Woodruff athletics, because if it wasn't for that, then this project never would have happened. But she finds a way to put up with me, and I'm forever grateful for that, because if she didn't, I don't think I would be standing here talking to you right now. But without mincing any words, I do want to tell you a little bit about how this project came to be. And really started about 2.5 years ago. It was in midsummer of 2020. And we were right in the middle of the COVID-19 pandemic. And it was at a time where everything was still more or less shut down. We didn't really know a lot about what was going on. And I certainly didn't have any ball games to go to or anything to cover. And quite frankly, I was just a little bit bored. And so I needed something to kind of keep my mind occupied and to keep the creative juices flowing. And on top of that, I needed to find some things to write about that I thought readers might like to read or reminisce about. And so I went to Tracy and I pitched an idea to her about Tracy Sanders, right here, owner of the Woodruff Times. And I should say Tracy as well. Let me backtrack for just a minute. Tracy has been so incredibly supportive, as well as Veriva Harris, these two ladies who own the Woodruff Times and make that possible. And again, without them, I wouldn't be here. So thankful for Tracy and Veriva as well. So here it is. It's probably June to early July 2020. And sitting around the house one night, as so many people were during that time, and not being able to get out or do anything, enjoy the things that we had been accustomed to enjoying, I had an idea that just kind of popped into my head, something that I thought might be interesting or that readers might like to take a look at. So I texted Tracy and I said, you know, I've got an idea. I said, we're a monthly paper. We print one time a month. So how about a series of stories, one story a month for 12 months, that looks back at some of the history of Woodruff High School athletics? And the idea that I had was to highlight different athletes, different programs. I didn't want to just base the series on one or two athletic teams and kind of limit the scope, because if you've lived in Woodruff long enough, then you know there's some incredible athletic history here in this town. It goes far beyond football, and Coach Varner, as monumental as that was to who we are and to who our identity is. We've had great wrestlers and wrestling teams, basketball teams, cross-country runners, softball players, baseball players, you name it. We run the entire gamut athletically when it comes to our history. And so I wanted to do something that really highlighted some of these athletes and maybe some of the more obscure stories that people had over the course of time forgotten about, or maybe that some of the newer generations of people who live here in Woodruff and call our town home maybe didn't remember or had never even heard of before. And so I pitched the idea to Tracy about doing this 12-story, 12-part series called Moments That Changed Wolverine History. And I explained to her what I wanted to do, and she was incredibly receptive right from the get-go and just embraced the idea. Her and Veriva both did. And so I went to work on that, and I started the series with a story, and it's the story I went back and forth on which one I wanted to read to you tonight, but I think I'm going to read the story that got it all started, and it was about what brought Coach Varner here to Woodruff. And everybody knows how close he and I were. Coach Varner was a great mentor and confidant to me during some of my more troubled times when I was younger. And really, I credit him greatly to bringing me where I am today. And but it was Coach Varner that not only impacted me, I was just well down the line of people whose lives he had an impact on. There are people sitting in this room whose lives Coach Varner impacted going all the way back to the 1950s and 1960s, and just an incredible man that really was such an integral part of our history. Certainly not the only one. but I used his story and how he came to Woodruff to really kind of kick there. The responses from the readers and the impact that it seemed to be having was just tremendous. The feedback that I kept getting was just unbelievable. And so I kept going, and as I went, I uncovered a lot of great stories, some that went all the way back as far as the 1920s or 30s, some that are what I would call modern or present day, that just happened within the last decade. And when you put them all together, it really is, it coalesces to tell the story of a huge part of what Woodruff history is about, and that's our athletic. And so about Stacy called me one night and said, hey, this is going over really well. People are enjoying these. What would you think about, when you're done with it, publishing them all together as a book? I said, well, hey, I like that idea. It had always been a goal of mine. I didn't quite envision that this is how the first one would come to be or come to pass. I'm certainly glad that it did. But I like the idea. I told Tracy, absolutely, let's look into that. And so to kind of cut to the chase, we got through the initial 12 parts of the series. But by that point, I had already uncovered some more things that I wanted to write about, or some topics that I wanted to explore. And at that point, I told Tracy, I said, you know what? Let's just keep going with this. Even if we call it an unofficial continuation of the series, let's just keep going. And so I kept going and going and going. And when it finally settled, when the smoke finally settled and the dust cleared, 21 stories later, 21 stories, 21 chapters. And that is what brings us to today. And the original series was called Moments That Changed Wolverine History. And by the time that we were making final preparations for the book, then that turned into We Are the Wolverines. Because at the end of the day, that's what we all are. It doesn't matter when you played or when you wore the maroon and gold, what sports you played or what impact you had, be it big, small, or anywhere in between. Everybody that lives in this town, if you've just moved here, if you've lived here your entire lives, or if at any point you've had a past connection or connotation to the town of Woodruff, you're a Wolverine. We are all Wolverines. And that was the genesis, the inspiration, and ultimately the culmination of why we're here tonight with the book. It's something that I'm incredibly proud to have been able to accomplish, but I could not have done it without everybody along the way, and that includes everybody in this room that supported me, has offered their words of encouragement. I'm certainly eternally grateful for that, and simply put, I'm just glad to be standing here tonight, so I certainly do appreciate it. And anybody here that has any questions about the process or anything up into this point before we do a reading, I'm certainly happy to answer any questions. I may have covered it all. Well, we can certainly we can go right into the reading. All right, the chapter, as I spoke about when I first started, the chapter I'm going to read is chapter 2. And what we did when we published the book, the chapters appear not in the order that I originally wrote them for the paper, but once we put the final version of the book together, what I decided to do was go in chronological order from the historical moment in time that these events and these things happened, and to put them in chronological order. And so it kind of brings together a complete history, or as much as it can, from start to finish. And so from a chronological standpoint, chapter 2, which I'm going to read tonight, would in terms of chronology be number 2 on the list. And this chapter is called Legends Never Die. And that it's a moniker that I've used. It's a term that I've used when I talk about Coach Varner being the legend that he was, the impact that he had. And even though he's been gone for 13, 14 years now, it's his memory we're able to keep alive. And certainly that's something that I don't see perishing anytime soon here in the town of Woodruff. And that was really the basis for this chapter. And it was the story that I used to kick off the original series. And so that's what I'm going to read now. Legends Never Die. Willie Varner never planned to stay at Woodruff long, but almost 7 decades after his fateful hiring, his legacy transcends time and still reverberates through South Carolina high school football. Willie Leo Varner was only planning to stay at Woodruff High School 1 year. Almost 70 years on, Varner is still synonymous with Woodruff High School football, along with leaving a massive footprint whose steps are still traced among the coaching ranks in South Carolina to this day. In 1953, however, Woodruff was a baseball town, with a booming textile industry and with Mill Hill baseball teams turning out elite talent as fast as Mills Mill produced high-quality fabric. Football was but an afterthought in a community whose athletic interests lay between 90-foot paths of dirt on the local diamond. In the summer of '53, Varner, who had concluded a stint in the United States Army where he worked as a scout for the football squad at Fort Jackson, along with coaching the base's basketball team, was looking for a job. Varner's wife, Frances, happened to have a friend who she worked with at the Arkwright Textile Mill office in Spartanburg and was married to a Woodruff gentleman by the name of Furman Rogers. Rogers knew Varner was looking for a teaching and coaching position. As fate would have it, Rogers found himself at a Woodruff filling station some days later with Sam Brissy, at times superintendent of Woodruff schools. Brissy needed to hire an assistant coach, as the assistant in Woodruff at the time was departing for military service. Brissy asked Rogers to have Varner give him a call, which led to an interview, and Varner was given the job. It was a hire that came with one caveat. Varner would not be given the job if he and Frances did not relocate to Woodruff. Varner agreed, expecting at the time that Woodruff would be but a 1-year stop on the way to a career closer to Spartanburg and the Arkwright community where his family still resided. That short tenure never came to pass, and looking back on that year decades later, Varner knew deep down that Woodruff was home. "I came here with the intention of staying 1 year," recalled Varner. "That's all I intended to stay in Woodruff. I guess it kind of grew on me. It was like being at home, in a sense, because in those days it was strictly a mill town. It was textile-oriented completely and farm-oriented. My grandfather on one side was a farmer, and I loved to go out on the farm. And my dad had been in textiles for a long time, so I loved textiles. I loved the people here. They were just real, genuine people. And if they didn't like you, they told you so." Nobody living in Woodruff in 1953 would have imagined then what would take place over the next 43 years. Following the conclusion of that year's football season, the head coach at the time, Bill Jolly, stepped down to take over the now long-closed Hickory Tavern High School in Lawrence County. 1 year removed from his arrival in Woodruff, Varner was named head football coach. Woodruff at that time had never experienced appreciable success on the football field. Varner, a doggedly determined leader, wanted to change that. He had football experience. Despite never having played a down of high school football for Spartanburg due to an adolescent injury, Varner, who was a true giant for his time at 6 feet 5 inches tall and 300 pounds, was given an opportunity to play at Wofford College, where he became a star. Years later, he would take what he had learned under then Wofford coach Phil Dickens and bring those lessons to Woodruff. It was a model for winning that had worked for the Terriers program of the late 1940s, and Varner knew it would work for his Wolverines too. "I was a pretty good all-around attempt at an athlete anyway," said Varner, "so they gave me a scholarship to Wofford to play football. I graduated and I wanted to coach. That's what I wanted to do. And I went to Wofford with coaching in mind. I stayed there 5 years. I played and scouted for an extra year." He continued, "I only played 1 game the first year against Fort Jackson, and I didn't want it to count, but it counted anyway. I stayed for an extra year to play football. I scouted for the varsity and helped coach the B team. That made me even more interested, and I coached Little League teams and Pony League teams and Boy Scout teams and all that sort of stuff during that period of time." At Woodruff, though, it took a change of mindset and an all-out effort to get the townsfolk on board with his football vision. After all, with Textile League baseball booming as steadily as the looms in the mills, football was but an afterthought anyway, until 1956. That year, the Wolverines broke through, and Varner's 3rd season as head football coach, led by the sensational Bob Ivy, the Wolverines defeated St. Andrews to win the school's first state football championship. A year later, in 1957, Woodruff defended their crown against Langley Bath Clearwater, It was then that a shift in perception began among those who had been indifferent toward the sport for so long that it had been but a stopgap to pass the time between baseball seasons. We had some success pretty quickly, some improvement over what they'd had in the past, Varner said. We showed them something that they didn't know about. The students, teachers, people in town had not gotten involved. They knew about baseball. They had those 3 mills and those textile teams, and they were very good. They didn't like football. They were a baseball town. They wanted their boys to play baseball. Some of our success changed that. They eventually wanted those boys to play football. In that era, most high school athletic programs operated with far fewer coaches on staff than is seen today. Many schools counted on one coach to lead multiple teams. Woodruff was no exception, with Varner coaching the baseball team as well, also with great success. In 1957, the same season that the Wolverines won their 2nd consecutive football championship, Varner led the Woodruff baseball team to the first of 2 straight titles. He would coach the baseball program for 6 seasons, compiling a record of 72-19, and in doing so helped bridge the divide between the 2 programs. Football, however, was where Varner's heart was. According to his longtime friend, assistant coach and football statistician Randy Grant, it was by the early 1960s that Varner's fame and legend among the South Carolina football ranks began to firmly take root. By the time I was in junior high school, which I guess was 1960 or 1961, I think it was by then, said Grant, I had the feeling, and I think it was shared by many around here, we just seemed to know that by that time we got to the early 60s that Varner wasn't leaving Woodruff. This man's going to stay here, and he's dedicated to this. Varner, said Grant, had multiple opportunities to leave for bigger and perhaps at the time more lucrative job opportunities. It was a sense of loyalty to Woodruff, its people, and his players that kept Varner rooted as a pillar of the town for well over 50 years, even once his coaching career ended following the 1996 season. I don't think he ever completely ruled leaving out, Grant said, but I always felt like it would have to be something really great for him to leave. I do know many other places were certainly interested and called, but I'm not sure they got very far. He knew he had his program running like he wanted it to, and I think Coach felt that if he went somewhere else, he would have to start from scratch. He was happy to continue with the success that he was building on here. By Varner's own words, he had multiple chances to move on, though it was something that he never strongly considered. Woodruff was his home, and Varner was creating a dynasty and one that still reverberates today. I had a couple of opportunities to leave, but I didn't take them, recalled Varner. I don't have any regrets. There were a couple of out-of-state jobs, and I was offered the Wofford job a couple of times, but I didn't want to go. Let's face it, at that time, high school coaching was a little bit better situation financially than college coaching. Later, I was offered the Dorman and Spartanburg jobs a couple of times, but I just couldn't pull myself away. Woodruff had become home to me. And so, Varner's Wolverines became one of the prominent dynasties in high school football, not only in South Carolina, but at the time, anywhere in the United States. Woodruff would win their 3rd state title in 1965, and then starting in 1975, became a household name by winning every 2A championship from 1975 to 1978, and again in 1980. Varner's final 2 championships in 1983 and 1984 were spearheaded by legendary quarterback Tony Rice. Rice led Woodruff to 38 consecutive victories between 1983 and 1985, which would prove to be the epilogue in the golden age of Woodruff football. Just 12 years later, Varner would be replaced as the Wolverines coach in a move decried by the community who continued to love and support him, even after 4 decades. The coaching lineage left by Varner was still very much alive and well, and the young assistant coaches who he taught and then sent into the coaching ranks to win multiple state championships of their own. Keith Richardson, who coached under Varner from 1964 to 1968, would go on to coach the Wolverines' arch rivals, the Clinton Red Devils, to 6 Class 3A state titles from 1969 to 1993. Shell Dula, who coached with Varner from 1970 to 1976, went on to lead 96 Union and Greenwood high schools to a collective 7 championships between 1977 and 2008. Richardson and Dula, among others, would in turn develop many assistants themselves who would become head coaches, with many in the coaching community able to trace their knowledge back to the tree started by Varner so many years ago. Even after they moved on, Varner never did forsake his relationships with his old assistants. What most people don't realize is that in the 5 years I was with Coach Varner, we established an early morning meeting, said Richardson. Well, after I got to Clinton, I often visited early in the morning on the telephone. It wasn't always about who you were playing and that sort of thing, but was more about how are you and what are you doing? Do you need anything? Do you need help? We always looked at playing each other as a no-loss situation. We knew even if we lost those games, our teams would go on to have very successful seasons. Dula remembers Varner as a coach who worked tirelessly to set his assistants up for future success, knowing that they would one day leave to take over programs of their own. Coach Varner taught you the game, said Dula. He also stood back and let you coach. Working with him was truly a pleasure. When we left Woodruff after the 1976 season, I told my wife that I was almost afraid to tell him that we were leaving for 96. She said, well, you'd have to tell him. He was extremely gracious and happy for me and always said, if I needed anything, just pick up the phone. Varner was always a bit tongue-in-cheek about facing his old assistants on Friday nights. I hated to play my old assistants, he said. If you lose, you're miserable. If you beat them, you almost feel sorry for him. We had a really good rivalry with Clinton, and we matched up pretty well. When our scouts called in our scores, the very first thing I'd asked them to find out was how Clinton did. We had a pretty good feeling that if Clinton had beaten a team, then we could too. In retrospect, Varner said in his final years that the most significant impact that he hoped to have left was the closeness and friendships he had formed with so many of his former players, coaches, and within the Woodruff community. If that was his lasting legacy, then Varner knew he would leave the world a blessed man. More than the number of games he had won or the championships to his credit, it was what he was most proud of. The most gratifying thing is the effect you have on people, he said. The kids that I see now, the parents that I see who come up to me and speak with you. I don't go anywhere without somebody recognizing me from the coaching days and wanting to talk. It's that kind of thing that sticks in your mind. I wouldn't swap professions with anybody. And I've said that repeatedly. I never had any desire to be a principal, and I never had any real burning desire to go anywhere else. I got a chance to do what I wanted to do, and I enjoyed every minute of it. Looking back, especially by those who are still here and can remember those early years, one could find it hard to believe that the hiring of one young assistant coach who only planned to stay 1 year in a small mill town in southern Spartanburg County would completely change the fortunes of their school and the town forever. It was a moment that changed Woodruff's history forever. Coach Varner's daughter, Tony Sloan, summed it up best. Legends never die, she said. I think that's the case with Daddy. Wouldn't it be amazing if you could do a family tree and put him as the roots and see all of the branches and where they went? Can you visually imagine that family tree of football that originated from Daddy here in Woodruff? I think as long as there is still somebody out there who played for him, coached with him, coached against him, then there will always be that spark of Daddy that is still alive.